that was Hem singing The Beautiful Sea. And you are listening to Wild Side on Source 96.1 FM. And we are in fact talking about the beautiful sea today. Only in this case we're talking specifically about one of its most amazing features, and that is corals. And now that I've kind of gone through the background of individual corals, I'm going to talk about corals in the form that we're most familiar with them in, and that is coral reefs. Now, most coral reefs formed after the last glacial period, which was about 10,000 years ago. And at this time you had all of the ice that was melting and increasing the sea levels. And if you know anything about corals, you know that they're found, most of them, within about 50 meters of the surface. And so you wouldn't think that actually increasing the sea level would make them more likely. But what happened is that you had all this water coming from the glaciers, and it ended up raising the sea level so that it covered up continental shelves. And when you've got these nice continental shelves that are covered with a kind of a thin layer of water, that's really the perfect environment for corals, because you've got a very short bit of water there that's exposed to a lot of heat and energy from the sun, and so it becomes nice and warm and tropical. And also most of those layers of the water are going to be exposed to the sun and the sun's rays, and the algae that live there are going to be able to use that energy to photosynthesize. And so actually it's quite perfect, these nice shallow environments up next to the continents. Now, of course, reefs come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and you can classify them into three main types, although there are lots of little subclasses and kind of variants as well. So the ones that we tend to see and think about the most often are the fringing reef, and this guy is attached to the shore or borders it with only a small, shallow channel or lagoon in between. And then similarly you can have a barrier reef, which is probably the one that we're all most familiar with. And this type of reef is separated from the mainland or from an island shore by a very deep channel or lagoon. So these guys are quite similar, but they just have kind of a different depth of water in between the reef and the land itself. And then there's an atoll reef, which is circular or forms kind of a continuous barrier all the way around a lagoon in the middle, and it has no central island. So basically it's just a reef that surrounds kind of a lake. And most, if not all of those, are formed by volcanoes. So basically, actually, the first person who came up with a theory of how this might have happened was Darwin. And Darwin found these reefs when he was on his voyage, and he was trying to figure out why it is that you would have these things out in the center of the ocean, and how might this have happened. And he correctly guessed that what might happen is that you've got a volcano out in the middle of the ocean, and after it's active for a while and it finally goes dormant, it may eventually kind of sink as you've got tectonic activity and things going on below the surface. And when it sinks, it eventually just leaves a little bit at the top, and so you've got this quite, precipitous mountain basically under the surface of the water, but at the top you've got that nice kind of ring shape around the caldera, and that's where the reef will grow, and in the middle then you've got that nice collection of water which forms the lagoon. And there are other types of reefs that are tectonic in origin, so you've got this tectonic activity that lifts up the ocean floor and puts it close to the surface so that the corals have a nice place to live. And you also have lots of different other variants of coral reefs, so you've got things like patch reefs, apron reefs, bank reefs, ribbon reefs, table reefs, micro-atolls, and even keys. So they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, as I said, and this is one of the things, again, that makes them really interesting, because they do have quite a lot of variation, both within reefs and among different reefs. Now, amazingly, coral reefs are the world's largest biogenic structures, so things that are created by nature itself. And they're actually so large that they are visible from space, and they're the only such structures of which this is true. Of course, there are human-made structures that we can see from space, like the Great Wall of China, but this is the only structure that's naturally made that you can actually distinguish from space. And in addition to being able to categorize them into different types of reef, we are also able to subdivide them into different zones. So if we're looking at a specific reef, we can identify certain areas that we tend to see occurring in most of the different coral reefs that we're looking at. And depending on exactly what aggregation of species and what type of environment they're living in, some reefs may not have all of these things, but most of them have at least a few. And the different zones there can be anywhere from 3 to 6 of them. And they're basically categorized based on the water depth, any given area of the reef, the action of the water, so whether it's there's a whole lot of wave activity or if it's a bit more still, the different types of organisms that are present, so whether it's just the corals themselves, or corals plus fish, or whatever other organisms might settle in the area. So some of these include the big six that people have come up with are the reef surface, and this is the shallowest bit where the water is most agitated and where the photosynthetic activity is the greatest. And this is also where it's easiest for the for the corals to feed on plankton. And the organisms in this area have to be quite hardy in order to withstand all the action of the waves. So this is where you get the corals that are really tough, and the more delicate ones are a bit further down. Another area is the off-reef floor, and this is a shallow floor that surrounds the reef, and this is we see this on continental shelves. And it often contains seagrass meadows where the fish that live around the reef will go forage. You also can find a reef drop-off, and this is where it declines down into the depths. And this is for the reefs that we find around oceanic islands and atolls. So you often have a lot of underwater activity that's pushing up land so that it's right at the surface, and then underneath the surface it drops off quite suddenly. The reef face is another zone. And this is it's a zone around the reef floor or around the reef drop-off. And it's very rich and very complex because you've got a lot of crevices in which animals can hide, and also lots of food. So you have lots of organisms settling in this zone of the reef. Then you've got the reef flat, and that's found behind the main reef, and it's between the reef and a nearby landmass or lagoon. So it might be home to lots of the fish that are associated with the reef because they can kind of go back and forth and take advantage of what you've got there on the reef, but also take advantage of the nutrients and the little animals that might be coming off of the landmass itself. And finally, the last bit is something that you only find on atoll reefs, and that is the reef lagoon, and that's the area that's encircled by the corals. Now, corals are actually some of the most diverse and productive ecosystems on Earth. There's an amazing amount of stuff going on and lots of different organisms that are living there. And that's despite the fact that they're actually found mostly in waters where there are very few nutrients naturally. So in these shallow depth areas, in the tropical waters that I've been mentioning, you tend to not have a whole lot of nutrients. You actually have more nutrients that are being dispersed from really deep sea environments where you have kind of tectonic activity that disperses stuff that's been under the ocean floor, and it comes up through the fissures. So the corals and the things that live with them there have to be actually quite good at getting nutrients out of the environment and sharing them with each other. But as I mentioned earlier, there are also a few deep and cold water corals. And all of these guys, whatever type of coral we're talking about, they create an environment, and that's why they are such an important ecosystem, because it's really the corals that are responsible for this. And they allow the organisms to productively exchange seawater and sediments and nutrients and all of the energy that is actually in that system. And so thanks to the fact that the corals provide a home to the algae, and thanks to the photosynthetic activity of the algae, you have all these nutrients that are there, what few there are, being taken up very well and produced very well into other forms that these other organisms can then eat and live off of. And cumulatively, coral reefs occupy only less than 0.1% of the world's complete surface area of oceans. So that's about 300,000 square kilometers. But they're home to about a quarter of all marine species. So despite having such a small physical presence, they have a really important presence in terms of biodiversity. Now, the bulk of reefs are found in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Southeastern Asia kind of whole area, Malaysia, Indonesia, and also in the Pacific. And in particular, they're quite common in Southeast Asia and Australia. So 90% of all reefs are found in all of those areas, and then the other 10% or less are found in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. And the tropical corals, as you might expect, they prefer quite nice temperatures, so something around 26 to 27 degrees, which is really quite hard to think about when you live here in the UK and have a little dance of happiness if the water ever gets up to 13 degrees or 15 degrees. So these are really warm, comfortable waters. Amazingly, some of the corals in the Persian Gulf have actually adapted to tolerate really huge seasonal fluctuations. So during the winter, it can go down as cold as 13 degrees, but then in the summer it can go up as high as 38 degrees. And so these guys are actually some of the toughest corals that there are because they do have to go between such extremes. And the deep water corals that I keep mentioning, so for example, those that live near Norway they can tolerate temperatures that go all the way down to 4 degrees Celsius, so it's practically freezing down where they are. And as I mentioned before, they can go really low, so anywhere from 40 to maybe 2,000 meters below the surface of the sea. So it is really cold down there, and despite that, they're able to survive, even though they don't have any symbionts to help them get energy from photosynthesis. Now, if you know anything about coral reefs, if you've ever heard a news story about them or seen them in a documentary of some sort, then you'll probably be familiar with some of the most impressive and well-known varieties. And these include Australia's Great Barrier Reef, which has about 2,900 individual reefs and 900 more islands. This is really quite an extensive area, and is actually thought of as one of the best managed coral reefs in the world as well. Then there's the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef System, and that goes from the tip of Mexico down to Honduras, and that's the second biggest system in the world. There are also some corals in the Red Sea that are almost 6,000 years old, so these are some of the oldest that we know of. Down in Pooley Ridge, Florida, we have the deepest photosynthetic coral reef. So as I said, they need to be near the surface in order to do photosynthesis because most of the sun's rays are taken up within the first 10 to 20 meters. But these guys are actually able to go quite a bit deeper than that and take advantage of the sunlight, so they have some really good algae. And then in the Raja Ampat Islands in Indonesia, these are the coral reefs that are known to have the highest marine diversity in the world. And that's really saying something when you consider that coral reefs in general have some of the highest diversity of any ecosystem that we know of. And that was Cat Power singing Sea of Love. Now, today we're talking about coral reefs, and I've mentioned that they are incredibly biodiverse, since they're some of the most exciting ecosystems that we have because there's so many different organisms that live there. And what's interesting about these guys is that actually the coral reef itself is a skeleton that's produced by these individual little coral polyps. And although reefs are predominantly made up of coral skeletons, so that all of that calcium carbonate that they're depositing, they can also contain lots of other things from the environment, like bits of shell fragments and remnants of calcareous algae, and all these things together add hardiness to help the reefs deal with their physical threats. And I've kind of mentioned these kind of fleetingly earlier on. The fact that the skeletons are always being eroded by waves and by grazing fish, by things like sea urchins and sponges, so all these other organisms and also these abiotic factors are always working to kind of wear down the reefs, and so they have to keep growing themselves back up. And as they are eroded by these factors in the environment, they create chunks in sand that all come off and they surround the reef. And actually those things contribute as well to the environment, and they provide a substrate for other organisms to live on, or in, as the case may be. And so actually, even though this is not maybe so great for the coral that they're being eroded away, it's actually quite good for the ecosystem as a whole, because all these little bits and pieces at various stages during the coral's life can really contribute to form a habitat for other species. And there are lots of different other species that are found on or in reefs. And this includes things like fish and mollusks, worms and crustaceans, echinoderms, sponges, tunicates, sea turtles, occasional dolphins even. Lots of seabirds will come visit reefs, obviously from above, they're not swimming around down next to the reefs. And also things every now and then like sea snakes. And not all of these things are there all of the time, but you often do have quite a lot of organisms that will visit at various points in their lives in order to get food or find a nice place to hide out as they're growing or trying to find a mate or whatever the case may be. And because of this, often this frequent change of organisms and also the frequent environmental disruption that you tend to find in these nice tropical areas, things like hurricanes, for example, you do tend to have lots of change at a reef. You have migration, you have movement of sediments, you have growth of the corals themselves. And so the reef is really not a static thing, but something that's always changing and growing and becoming new and different. And it's also quite interesting if you go at different times of day to the same reef, because you'll find out that the diurnal and the nocturnal animals may trade off. So for example, if you go during the nighttime, you might see cardinal fish and squirrel fish being quite active, but then if you go to that same reef during the day, you might see damselfish and surgeonfish, triggerfish, wrasses, parrotfish, all sorts of different things. And these guys will trade off and be active at different times of day. And if you look at a coral reef, you've got the producers and also the consumers. So the producers are the ones that are responsible for taking the energy of the sun and turning it into something that all the other animals can access, or other organisms in general. So these are things like phytoplankton and seaweed and coralline algae, also known as turf algae. And then the consumers that come in and take advantage of all this photosynthetic activity are the things like fish and crustaceans, and these guys will pass the nutrients along to the other trophic levels, so the other organisms higher up that will eat these guys. And all these nutrients are then recycled in the ecosystem, which is why you have these areas supporting such high diversity relative to other parts of the ocean. So, like I said, you don't really have a whole lot of nutrients in the area, so because you've got these organisms that are quite good at harvesting what is there and then transferring it to each other and amongst each other, you do have quite a whole lot of diversity that can be sustained because they are quite efficient at passing energy from one level of the food web on to another. Now, coral reefs often have very close relationships with other ecosystems, so things like mangrove forests and seagrass meadows, and there's a big flow of organisms between these. So things like the meadows and the forests will serve as nurseries for young animals that may come from the reef and grow up in these other ecosystems and then come back as adults. And so there is quite an important kind of conservation thing here where you've got to protect all of these areas rather than just one or another. And the corals kind of return the favor by protecting these habitats from strong wave activity, while the habitats, in addition to providing things like, for instance, the fish that will come and eat at the corals, they will the corals will then also be protected from influxes of silt from the land, from too much fresh water, which would change the pH, and from things like pollutants. So there is quite a close relationship between these different types of environments. Now, reefs have a lot of value to us, actually, besides just being kind of beautiful and interesting. They are really important for tourism and also for fisheries. So tourism obviously associated with boating and snorkeling and scuba diving. And fishing is really incredibly important. So about 6 million tons of fish are taken from reefs each year. And this works out to about 15 tons of seafood per square kilometer each year. That's quite impressive. And the fish take includes both edible fish and also those that are used in the pet trade. So, Finding Nemo, for example, you do have little fish that are taken as pets as well as being sold at market. And in fact, because of all of these things together, the global value of reefs is estimated at about 230 billion pounds per year, which is pretty amazing. And that's actually why it's really scary that coral reefs are so threatened. So, as I said, in addition to the fact that these are really impressive and valuable and interesting sites, it's also quite tragic to lose something that's such an economic resource. And the reason that they're threatened, well, there are many reasons, but it really boils down to the fact that they're really delicate ecosystems. They're subject to both natural and anthropogenic disturbances. So things like algae can encroach on the reefs, and they need to be constantly eaten by grazers in order to be kept in check. So if you've got overfishing and also excess nutrient supply, so maybe runoff of fertilizers from the land, this can allow the algae to take over and kick out the coral. Also, excess nutrients in general can be quite dangerous because it can pollute the water. It can change the pH in the ocean, and also the ocean can have a change because of acidification related to greenhouse gas emissions. And global warming and greenhouse gas emissions in general are associated also with sea temperature rises and sea level rises, and both of these things, as I've kind of indicated already, can be really catastrophic because the corals really need to have a certain type of temperature and a certain distance down from the surface of the sea. They can only tolerate so much limitation of the sunlight that they have access to. And other anthropogenic threats include overfishing, habitat destruction, and also introduced species which may interact differently with the corals than the species that they're used to. But then they also have to face things like natural threats, disease, destruction from storms, so they live in areas where there might be big hurricanes that can disrupt the environment. So there are lots of issues that they might have to deal with. And I said earlier on that when they have this kind of threat that makes them quite nervous, the corals will often expel their symbionts in order to try to survive over the short term. And when this mutualism has ended and the corals are left on their own and they haven't taken up a new one because they just don't have the energy to do so, they're said to be bleached. And they have this very white kind of skeletal look, and they're very unhealthy. And approximately 10% of all known coral reefs are now thought to be dead, and another 60% are at risk. And projections suggest that as many as 90% of all reefs could be threatened over the next 20 years. And that's why we have a whole lot of efforts in order to restore coral reefs using lots of different methods. Coral aquaculture, where you grow young corals in nurseries and then plant them on reefs. Also, you can supply extra substrate to promote their growth. There are even efforts to look into applying low-voltage current in order to dissolve minerals onto steel structures that are put out to attract the baby corals as they're settling, and then increase coral colonization and growth. So, although we hear about corals as a flagship species, and we're really interested in doing all these interesting and weird and different kind of conservation and management techniques, there's actually a whole lot that's not known about them. So I've only mentioned a few things here that are being done to try to help corals, but people are always looking out for new things. And they're also trying to figure out how these corals are going to respond to the changing environment, and what aspects of their life history can we kind of exploit in order to find a way to help them survive. And one important thing will be finding out how connected individual reefs are with each other, so maybe we can use one healthy reef to try to propagate a bit and help one that's neighboring that's not doing quite so well. We also need to know about the diseases that are impacting them, and how and why these diseases are gaining a foothold, and whether they are going to rebound eventually after they face all of these threats that they're finding in the environment because of us and also because of natural problems. And hopefully, ongoing studies on all of these sorts of topics and others as well will allow us to protect these really interesting, unique, and very colorful ecosystems over time. And with that, I will leave you with the Black Keys singing about oceans and streams.